Hello everyone, I want to welcome you to this particular section. In this section, I will be discussing about pathways related to catabolism of glucose. And first, I would give a brief summary of various pathways involving catabolism of glucose. Then I would start to talk about each of these pathways one after the other. So this video would be a series. But in this first one, I will talk particularly about glycolysis. So first, when we talk about catabolism of glucose, it means we are talking about the breaking down of glucose to simple molecules such as carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, which is H2O. This process is accompanied by release of energy in the form of a chemical molecule called ATP. So ATP is a biological molecule that represents energy in biological systems. So along this process of breaking down glucose to simple units as carbon dioxide and water, ATP is produced, and that also implies that energy is generated. This in glucose is used in making ATP. So another thing to also take note is that this process of glucose catabolism is important because glucose is the major monomeric unit of most carbohydrates. So when carbohydrates generally are digested, the end product of the process of carbohydrate digestion are simple sugars. And like I said, one of the major simple sugar is glucose, aside fructose, galactose, and several other simple sugars or monosaccharides that exist. So, and that's why there is much focus on glucose. So in this first slide, it gives a general overview of the different processes that are involved in the breaking down of glucose to yield CO2 and H2O. Now the first process, or the first stage in this process of glucose catabolism, is the conversion of glucose to two units of pyruvate. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. Pyruvate is a 3-carbon system. So you're having 2 3-carbon systems. So that is the first stage, the conversion of glucose to pyruvate. That is the first stage of glucose catabolism, and this stage is what is referred to as glycolysis, which I'm going to emphasize in this video. Now, the next step in the process of glucose catabolism depends on whether oxygen is present or not. If oxygen is present, then pyruvate enters into another stage, which is referred to as citric acid cycle. So in this, and that's where you have aerobic oxidation. So in citric acid cycle, so the pyruvate enters into this cycle through acetyl-CoA. That is not shown, that molecule is not shown in this place, but note that pyruvate is changed to acetyl-CoA before entering into TCA cycle. So in the citric acid cycle or tricarboxylic acid cycle, so that is where you have the release of carbon dioxide, yes, and water. And another thing also is that the process of citric acid cycle is also linked to a system called the electron transport chain. So, and this electron transport chain, what you have there basically is electron transfer to oxygen in order to generate water. So electron move from different complexes in this system, because electron transport chain is a system with several protein complexes. So electron is transferred from one complex to another until it reaches oxygen, whereby oxygen is now reduced to H2O. So take note that the TCA cycle is linked to a system called the electron transport system, and in this system, that is where oxidative phosphorylation takes place. That is, so two things take place at the electron transport chain. You have ATP synthesis, at the same time you also have electron transport. So it's the electron transport system is a combination of two systems, a system that a part generates ATP and a part is where you have flow of transport of electrons. So but this system also is linked to citric acid cycle, and that's why you have in this diagram at the end oxidative phosphorylation. Now that is what happens if oxygen is present, but in the absence of oxygen, the fate of pyruvate is to undergo anaerobic fermentation, a process whose product is different in yeast or bacteria compared to the products in animals. So if there is no oxygen, pyruvate from glycolysis undergoes anaerobic fermentation to yield ethanol and CO2 in bacteria or yeast, or either to yield lactate in animal. So, and that is the general or let me say the overview of all process involved in conversion of glucose to yield CO2 and H2O. So take note that the presence or the presence or absence of oxygen is also a very important factor in the process of glucose catabolism. But the first stage has nothing to do with oxygen. So all glucose undergoes the first stage to yield two pyruvate molecules. So, but what happens after pyruvate depends on the presence or absence of oxygen. Whether pyruvate will enter into a process of aerobic oxidation in the presence of oxygen, or whether it will enter into a process of anaerobic fermentation in the absence of oxygen. So this is the overview of glucose catabolism. So we will be talking in subsequent video, we'll be discussing each of these stages. The glycolytic stage, where glucose is converted to two pyruvate molecules, the tricarboxylic acid or citric acid cycle, where carbon dioxide is generated in the presence of oxygen, together with generation of water molecule through oxidative phosphorylation at the electron transport system. I will explain all of that, and we'll also discuss what happens if oxygen is absent and you have an aerobic fermentation, both in animal and also in yeast or bacteria. So in the next video, I'll be discussing the first stage, which is glycolysis, the conversion of the first stage of glucose metabolism, which involve the conversion of glucose to yield 2 pyruphate molecule. And also I will also want to note that this process we are looking at, which is catabolism of glucose, is relevant because it is a very important process in biochemistry of carbohydrates, because when carbohydrates are digested through the digestive system, the end product of the digestion process of carbohydrates yields simple sugars, and one of the major simple sugar found in carbohydrates is glucose. So that means when carbohydrates is digested in living system, and simple sugars are produced, which are monosaccharide, glucose, fructose, and galactose. When these major simple sugars are produced, what happens next is what we are discussing in this particular video, and which I believe also will be a series. So in the next video, I will be discussing the first stage, as I said earlier, which is glycolysis. Thank you for staying tuned on this channel, and I hope this video be helpful to you. Thank you.